Amidst a lavish party in Abu Dhabi, the arrogant billionaire threw down a challenge. Translate this line, and the Sheikh is yours. No one expected the poor waitress to speak up, yet a single sentence from her silenced the entire ballroom and saved him from $100 million scam. Can you believe that one sentence can change a destiny? Stay until the end to see the girl's answer that saved him from the scam of the century. That night, the Al-Qasr restaurant shone brightly like a gilded palace in the heart of Abu Dhabi. Beneath the domes inlaid with turquoise and crystal, the gentle sound of the oud mingled with the soft clinking of glasses. The aroma of fine wine and perfume blended together, creating an atmosphere reserved only for the elite. At the center table, Omar Al-Fahim, 38 years old, head of the Falcon Holdings Corporation, sat ramrod straight. He wore a perfectly tailored grey suit, a gold patek on his wrist. His face was angular, his grey eyes cold. The kind of man whose single glance was enough to make subordinates bow their heads. Beside him sat two foreign partners, including Julien Marchand, a French financial advisor whose smile was perpetually hidden behind a wine glass. The maitre d' bowed. "Sir, which wine will you be having tonight?" Omar answered concisely without hesitation. "Margaux 2004. It pairs well with the saffron lamb stew." Note that down his voice was deep, even, and decisive. The server took notes, bowed, and retreated. Everything unfolded, as if the entire room operated according to his will. But only a few seconds later, a quiet female voice cut through the luxurious atmosphere. "Excuse me, sir, but the Margaux 2004 has strong tannins. It will overpower the saffron in the lamb stew. A Chateau d'Yquem 2008 would be more balanced." Everyone turned to look. A girl in a serving uniform, slender, with black hair neatly pinned back, held a tray of glasses that shook slightly. Her eyes were deep, dark, and bright, a rare gaze in this world of metal and ambition. Julien chuckled softly, taking a sip of his wine. "She's right, Omar. D'Yquem is indeed more refined." Omar looked up. His eyes met hers. A moment of icy silence. He hated being corrected, especially in front of outsiders. "Bring the Margaux." One sentence, cold and definitive, closing off any further argument. The girl bowed her head. "Yes, sir." As she turned away, the light reflected off an old, worn silver ring on her finger. Omar noticed the detail. He didn't know why, but that small reflection made him uncomfortable, as if it reminded him that beyond this opulent world existed another layer, where people did not need gold to live. A few minutes later, she returned. The wine was poured. Golden light shimmered in the glass. Omar took a sip, then set the glass down hard on the table. The sound of crystal hitting wood was sharp and cold. "You were right." He paused. "But I don't need someone carrying a tray to teach me how to drink." Julien offered an uncomfortable smile. The girl stood still, not bowing, only speaking softly. "My apologies, sir. I only wanted your meal to be complete." That composure choked Omar. He couldn't get angry, yet he couldn't let it go either. He pulled a white silk handkerchief from his jacket pocket. On the edge of the cloth, a line of thin, intricate ancient Persian script was embroidered. He placed it on the table, his gaze challenging. "If you are as knowledgeable as you claim, translate this line. If you get it right," he smirked, "this sheikh will belong to you." Julien burst out laughing. "That's rich, Omar." "Let's see if she dares." The girl set her tray down. Her hand trembled slightly, but her eyes held no fear. She leaned in to read. A few seconds passed. Then she looked up, her voice even and clear. "One sees with the eyes, but is blind in the light." Not a sound. The candlelight flickered softly. The music faded completely. Julien tilted his head. Rumi's poetry. Absolutely spot on, Omar remained silent. Her sentence was like a gentle blade, cutting straight into the deepest part of his pride. He understood every word, and understood that, tonight, perhaps he was the one who was blind in his own light. He looked at her, then spoke quietly, his voice deep and cold. "What is your name?" "Mira Haddad, sir." "How old are you?" 26, sir." He gave a slight nod. "Did you study ancient languages?" "Yes. I studied Persian texts at the University of Beirut, but now I am just a waitress." Julian chimed in with a mocking smile. "A scholar carrying a tray. Truly an interesting era." The table chuckled. Mira didn't reply. She bowed her head, picked up the silk handkerchief, and placed it neatly back down. "Thank you for giving me the challenge, sir." Then she stepped back, walking away through the lights. When her shadow disappeared behind the curtain, Omar realized the wine glass in his hand was shaking. He put it down. In his mind, her words echoed. "One sees with the eyes, but is blind in the light." That Rumi verse. He had read it long ago in his father's books, but had forgotten its meaning. Now, hearing it from the mouth of a poor girl, it left him with a strange emptiness. Julian leaned over, shrugging. "She's intriguing." "Knows when to cross a line," Omar replied softly, his voice even, but his eyes still fixed on where she had vanished. "Or when to remind us that we are standing on the wrong side of the light." Back in the brightly lit kitchen, Mira washed her hands, trying to conceal her frantic heartbeat. She wasn't angry at the Sheikh. She just felt tired. Wealthy people like him. She had met many. But his eyes when he heard the verse, they didn't look like those of an arrogant man, but like someone who had just seen himself in a blurred mirror. She looked down at her hands, thin, calloused fingers that had once written theses on Persian culture, now only knowing how to carry trays and collect tips. But she had no regrets. At least tonight, she still had enough courage to speak the truth. A colleague walked past, whispering, "Are you crazy, Mira?" "Messing with Sheikh Al-Fahim is suicide." Mira smiled faintly. "I only talked about the wine." "No, you talked about his pride." The colleague left. Mira stood still. From the distant hall came the sound of glasses clinking. Omar was laughing. A social laugh, but she knew there was already a crack in it. She never imagined that just a few hours later, that very crack would cause the powerful Sheikh to lose everything. Late at night. The party concluded. Omar left the restaurant, walking through the grand, brightly lit lobby. As he passed the hallway, he saw Mira wiping down a table. She kept her head down, saying nothing. He stopped. A second of silence, only the distant background music. "Where did you learn that quote?" She looked up, her gaze calm. "From my father. He taught me that light is not for the arrogant." He smirked. "Who was your father?" "A professor of ancient languages." "He died in the war." Omar gave a slight nod, then walked away. But as the glass door closed, he still felt something lingering. A faint, yet persistent sound, like the burning of a candle in a dark room. The truth. Outside, the desert wind blew gently. On his car window, the lights reflected the Persian script, fading with every sweep of the wiper blade. That verse spun in his head all night, like a prophecy. One sees with the eyes, but is blind in the light. And he didn't know. That very sentence had just saved him from a colossal sin that would hit him the next morning. The kitchen of Al-Qasr the next morning was as noisy as ever, the clanging of pots and pans, the shouting of orders mixed with the smell of coffee and dish soap. Mira Haddad had just tied her hair neatly when the restaurant manager pulled her aside. His voice was low, yet contained a clear threat. "Mira, about last night. You made a VIP customer uncomfortable. Sheikh Al-Fahim is an important guest. You need to remember that." There was no official warning, but Mira understood the implication. This was the only job she had. Another mistake meant losing the source of income for her mother. She nodded slightly. "I apologize, sir. I will be more careful." The manager sighed and turned away. Mira stood still for a few seconds, took a deep breath, swallowing the bitterness in her throat. She had to keep going, 2 consecutive shifts today, to cover her mother's medication. By noon, the intense Dubai sunlight streamed through the large glass panes of the lobby, reflecting glaringly on the stone floor. Mira carried a silver tea tray, passing the rows of VIP tables. She kept her head slightly bowed, avoiding eye contact with the guests, trying to make herself invisible. Then she stopped short. At the corner table, dressed in a smoke-colored suit, sat Omar Al-Fahim. This time, there was no lavish party atmosphere, only cold focus and thick files spread out. He called for the tea server, a gesture that reminded her of her inferior role. On the table was the contract for the Sharif Region Community Development Project. The original was written in ancient Persian, alongside an English translation prepared by Julian Marchand. Julian opened his briefcase and smiled. "This is the final version. Just need your signature, and everything will be complete." Omar leaned back, sipping his tea. He wanted to finish this quickly to announce it to the board. Good. We won't let philanthropy drag on any longer. Julian nodded, quickly flipping through the pages. He deliberately rushed past the final appendix, the section concerning the transfer of community land management rights. "This part is just technical detail, standard long-term lease terms," Julian said. Mira brought the tea tray closer. She set the pot down so lightly that it was almost silent. But as her eyes scanned the stack of papers, she glimpsed bold Persian script at the top of a page. She froze. Her heart tightened. She recognized a familiar word. Amanat. She knew the word. Her mother had read it to her as a child. In ancient Persian, amanat means to hold permanently in trust for future generations, but the English translation below clearly stated long-term, transferable lease. That difference was not just a translation error, it was an act of heritage fraud. If she remained silent, the community land would be permanently seized under the guise of a contract. She took a deep breath, suppressing the fear of losing her job. "Excuse me, sir." Both men turned around. "What is it?" Omar asked, his voice cold. Mira pointed to the script on the page. The word amanat in the ancient Persian text means to hold permanently in trust for the community. Not a lease, just one word, can change the destiny of this land. The air thickened. Julian chuckled softly. A waitress who knows law. Impressive. Omar leaned back in his chair. He focused on Mira, the arrogance of the previous night suddenly returning, stronger than before. He didn't bother looking at Julian, but stared straight at her. "You seem to enjoy interfering in other people's business, don't you? Last night it was wine. Today it's a contract. What are you trying to prove?" Mira bowed her head a little lower, but her voice remained firm. "I am not teaching anyone. I just want you to know the true meaning of the word." Omar turned back to Julian, his voice sharp, dismissing her without a second thought. "I trust my partner's official translation over the word of a girl carrying a tray." He nodded, signaling, "That's enough. You seem to have forgotten where you are. You may step out." Mira stepped back. Her hands clenched the serving napkin tightly. She knew she had just signed her own termination notice. She quietly walked away, the sound of her shoes blending with the oud music from the outer lounge. In the hallway, she leaned against the wall, trying to remain calm. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. A message from the hospital. "Ms. Haddad's medication cost is outstanding." Please, complete payment today. She pursed her lips. The truth she had just spoken came at too high a price. A colleague walked by, asking softly, "Who did you correct this time?" Mira didn't answer immediately. She looked through the transparent glass, where Omar was leaning down to sign, his demeanor calm, confident, as if the world belonged to him. The sunlight reflected brightly, dazzlingly, on the tip of the pen. She spoke quietly, her voice barely audible. Someone who does not believe in the light. Then she turned away. Inside, Omar signed decisively. Julian collected the files, nodding with satisfaction. A bold black line of ink on the paper, clear, sharp, cold. Outside, through the glass, Mira still stood there. The light reflected her image onto the glass, merging with the shadow of Omar signing. Two figures, one reflected, one real, superimposed on each other. She didn't know that signature would be the first sign of blindness in his own light. That afternoon, the feeling of humiliation from noon still weighed heavily on Mira's shoulders. She had just finished her lunch shift, her shoulders aching from constantly running tables. She stopped at a small cafe near the hotel to buy a cheap loaf of bread for dinner. On her phone, her mother's medication bill still showed a red notification. Payment incomplete. She put the phone back in her pocket, took a deep breath, trying not to cry. Just then, the glass door of the cafe reflected the shadow of a person stepping out of a luxurious car. A tall figure, grey shirt, wearing sunglasses. Omar Al-Fahim. She froze. A rush of feelings, shame about her status, anxiety, and a touch of bitterness that the truth had been rejected. He didn't look at her, just walked past, talking to someone on the phone. Bring the documents to Al Noor Cafe. I need a final check before meeting the charity fund representative. That sentence made Mira curious. Al Noor Cafe was only 2 blocks away, a place often used for private meetings among investors. Late afternoon, fate skillfully led Mira back into the dangerous vortex. Needing more money, she accepted an extra shift, serving a private event at the Al Noor Cafe itself. When she entered the small function room, she gasped. Omar sat at the center table, facing Julien Marchand and 2 other European men. Julien noticed her, his eyes flashing with amusement. He saw this as the perfect opportunity to humiliate her one last time. "Oh, the linguistic lady has returned," he said loudly, deliberately ensuring the whole table heard. "We are truly destined to meet, aren't we?" The table laughed. Mira blushed, pursing her lips, but said nothing. She bowed her head, poured wine, her hands trembling slightly. Julien continued, his voice half joking, half mocking. "This time, please remember to pour the right wine, lest you lecture us on vocabulary again. I'm still pondering your words from yesterday. Just one word can change a destiny." That sentence, so poetic. Omar remained silent. He merely swirled the wine in his glass, his gaze deeper than usual, as if he agreed with Julian's sarcasm. Julien took the file from his briefcase, opening it to the last page. "I just want to confirm, Sheikh Al-Fahim. All terms have been reconciled. Next week only requires the final confirmatory signature, and we are done." Omar nodded, his voice brief. "Good." "I want this project concluded." Mira poured Julien more wine, her eyes involuntarily glancing at the open page on the table. Among the uniformly printed lines, she saw a handwritten line in blue ink on the right margin. A completely different script, skillfully added by Julien. Julien quickly placed his wine glass over the edge of the paper, but Mira had managed to read a few words. It was an ancient Persian proverb, one her mother used to recite. When one cuts the branch from the root, the tree will never sprout again. That line did not mean transfer, it meant complete severance. It would invalidate any possibility of reclaiming ownership. She couldn't remain silent. As Omar set his glass down, Mira spoke softly, her voice low but clear, trying to maintain maximum composure. "Excuse me, Sheikh al-Fahim. The proverb in the margin of that page, in ancient Persian, refers to permanent severance. It is not a common agreement. It means the complete loss of ownership." The entire table went still. Julian slowly put his wine glass down, his gaze cold as steel. "What are you talking about?" Julian asked, his voice starting to tremble with anger. "I just saw that note." Julian sprang up, slamming his hand on the table. "Are you implying that we are committing fraud?" Mira stepped back, her heart racing. Omar slammed his hand down, his voice deep, tired but full of pride. "Enough! I don't want to hear any more of your lessons." His voice echoed in the small space, silencing Mira. Omar stood up, looking straight at her, his eyes cold. "You have forgotten where you are. Get out." Immediately, there was no apology. No one sided with her. Mira nodded, picked up her tray, bowed, and left in silence. Julian's laughter echoed behind her. Perhaps she should write books on language instead of carrying trays. The words landed on her back, heavy as a stone. Mira reached to the hallway, leaning against the wall. Inside, the oud music and laughter continued, as if nothing had happened. She looked down at her shaking hands. The hands that had once held a pen to write a thesis now only knew how to hold a wine tray. Her breath was shallow, her throat tight. She had lost her job, lost everything for the truth. She wiped away her tears, looking up. Through the glass door, she saw Omar still sitting there, signing the final page. Black ink flowed onto the paper, a decisive stroke of the pen. Julian leaned in slightly, a victorious smile clearly on his face. The sound of the pen hitting the paper was dry, sharp, and cold, like a bullet fired in silence. She didn't know that each signature not only sold a piece of land, but also began to sell off the bright part of his own soul. The morning sunlight filtered through the thin curtains, shining into the small rented room where Mira and her mother resided. The room was simple, with only an iron bed, an old wooden table, and a few small potted plants Mira had bought from the market. On the table, the phone vibrated, the screen flashing with a new message. "Ms. Mira Haddad, your employment contract is terminated as of today. Please come collect your remaining wages at the end of the week." She sat silently, looking at the words as if looking at something she had known for a long time, but still felt a sting from. Not because of losing the job, but because the truth was left behind in a world where people only believed in power. She put the phone down, clasping her hands tightly, as if holding on to the last shred of her dignity. On the bed, Mrs. Nadia Haddad stirred softly. Her blind eyes turned toward her daughter's sigh. Her voice was light as a breeze. "Lost your job again, my daughter?" Mira quickly replied, trying to force a smile. "No, mother. The restaurant is just changing shifts. I'm off for a few days." Mrs. Nadia tilted her head, her lips gently pressed, her smile kind, yet sad. "Your hands are trembling again. Every time you lie, I hear it in your breath." She reached out, gently seeking her daughter's hand. Her palm was cold, dry, and trembling slightly. "You did the right thing, didn't you?" Mira bowed her head, her voice choked. "I only said what I saw. But perhaps no one needs the truth." Mother Mrs. Nadia smiled softly. Her cloudy eyes turned toward the small patch of light filtering through the curtain. "Your father also lost his job for telling the truth once," she recounted, her voice slow, like a gentle thread pulling back memories. "He was a scribe for a court. Once, they told him to amend a testimony to suit his superiors. He refused and was dismissed the very next day. I cried a lot then, but he only said one thing. People may not need the truth, but we must never abandon it. She held Mira's hand tighter. You are like him, so I am not afraid. As long as your heart remains bright, the light will remain. Mira was silent for a long time. Her mother's voice felt like it was stitching up the wound that had just been torn open. She spoke quietly. Light never belongs to those who close their eyes, does it, Mother? That's right, my daughter. We are poor, but we see with our hearts. Mira turned on the old TV, hoping to find some new job listings, but the first image on the screen made her freeze. Omar Al-Fahim's face appeared amidst the flash of lights and the sound of cameras. He stood confidently, dignified, with the Falcon Holdings logo behind him. Falcon Holdings has just signed the Sharif Region Community Development Project, bringing thousands of jobs and hailed as the largest humanitarian project this year. The anchor read steadily, while images of Omar shaking hands with Julian Marchand filled the screen. The caption below read, "A new vision for the future." Mira sat motionless, his smile on the screen, the smile that had been cold when he told her, "I don't need someone carrying a tray to teach me how to drink." Now, he was admired by the whole world. She didn't hate him, she just felt pity for a man who could do the right thing, but chose to trust the wrong person. At the same time, on the other side of the city. In the top-floor office of Falcon Holdings, the late afternoon sun shone through the thick glass, bathing the room in a light that was gold mixed with red, beautiful, yet cold. Omar Al-Fahim sat before his walnut desk, facing dozens of reports and contracts. A notification flashed on the screen. Update: change in ownership of Sharif land. He clicked it open, and in that moment, everything within him seemed to freeze. The line was clearly visible. Ownership rights of Sharif land have been re-registered under the name Julian Marchand. He frowned, thinking it was a system error, but after just a few clicks, he understood. This was no technical glitch. This was betrayal, clear, blatant. Omar stood up, but his legs felt weak. He called Julian, over and over, only the sound of a long, endless ring. Then the screen lit up. A new email. From Julian himself. Subject: Too late, Sheikh. Content: Honor cannot be translated. See you in Geneva. Attached below was a scan of the contract bearing Omar's own signature. The phone dropped onto the desk, sliding, emitting a dry, sharp clatter. He looked at the contract, his eyes stopping at the small Persian script under the appendix, the place Mira had pointed out to him. His hand trembled. He lightly touched his own signature, then whispered, as if speaking to someone no longer there. She saw this, and I did not. In that moment, anger turned into deep shame. A man who thought he saw everything turned out to only see the glare of his own glory. He muttered, his voice choked. She lost her job for telling the truth, and I lost my soul for staying silent. Omar sank back into the leather chair, staring through the wide glass. The city stretched out below in the blood-red sunset. Everything he had ever believed in, honor, power, wealth, was now an illusion. For the first time, he felt a light that did not come from the sun, the stinging light of truth. He looked at his own signature, and for the first time realized this hand once held power, but never touched the truth. On the other side of the city, in the poor labor district, Mira closed her old suitcase. She packed a few clothes, some half-used bottles of medicine. Her mother sat by the bed, her hand feeling the edges of the blanket. "Where are we going, my daughter?" "I heard. There's a Braille learning center in Sharjah. They need a cleaner. I'm going to apply there." Mrs. Nadia nodded, her tired but gentle smile still present. Wherever people need to learn, there is still light. Mira helped her mother stand up, her hand tightly holding the frail hand. The desert wind blew past, dry and stinging. They had just left the small alley when a black SUV slowly pulled up to the side of the road. The window lowered, and the man's voice inside was deep and soft. "Is this Miss Mira Haddad? Sheikh Al-Fahim wishes to see you." Mira froze. For a moment, she didn't know if this was the start of a new journey, or just the final light before the darkness. The black SUV turned off the main road, drove past a row of small, dimly lit public housing units, and stopped in front of a modest compound for Falcon Holdings security personnel. No iron fences, no grand gates, just simple, neatly arranged two-story buildings in the quiet darkness of Abu Dhabi. Mira helped her mother step out of the car. Mrs. Nadia Haddad, blind for many years, fumbled her way across the cold cement floor. Her hand trembled, gripping her daughter's hand tightly, a small, thin hand, yet still striving to keep her mother steady. A security guard approached, opened the door to a small room at the end of the hall, and bowed respectfully. "You may stay here temporarily. Sheikh Al-Fahim instructed us to prepare medication for your mother." Mira paused. On the old wooden table, a brand-new bag of medicine was neatly placed. The vials she hadn't been able to afford for days. Seeing them, Mira didn't feel grateful, but a lump in her throat, as if someone had lightly squeezed her heart. "Who told you to bring this?" she asked quietly, trying to remain calm. "I only follow instructions, ma'am." The man bowed and quietly left. The door closed, leaving mother and daughter in the quiet space, hearing only the wind outside the hallway and Mrs. Nadia's soft breathing. She reached out and touched the bag of medicine, smiling faintly. "A kind person has helped us, Mira. Don't you see, God still sees us." Mira swallowed hard. She didn't believe it was kindness, but a belated attempt at atonement. But seeing her mother's gentle smile, she couldn't bring herself to say it. She only replied softly, "Yes, Mother. Perhaps God is still watching." A moment later, there was a light knock on the door. The door opened. Omar Al-Fahim stepped in. No expensive suit, no gold watch, or powerful perfume. Just a man in a slightly wrinkled white shirt, his eyes dark-rimmed, like someone who had lost many nights of sleep. He stopped at the threshold, taking a soft breath, as if unsure if he had the right to step further. Mira stood tall, her natural reaction, gently stepping forward to shield her mother. Her voice was calm, but distant. "Sheikh Al-Fahim, what do you want from me? If it's an apology, I don't need it. If it's a job, I won't take it." Omar paused. His eyes wavered briefly. He took a step, then stopped when he met her composed gaze, no longer angry, but no longer trusting either. He spoke softly, his voice subdued. "I didn't come to ask for forgiveness. I came because of the truth. Julian deceived me. He seized the Sharif land using the contract you warned me about." The air in the room vibrated softly, as if someone had just touched a taut, thin string. Mira remained silent. A brief flash of bitterness crossed her eyes. Then she smiled lightly, a kind, yet sad smile. "I spoke that truth 3 times, sir. And all 3 times you chose to trust your pride. Now Julian is only doing what he does best, taking advantage of others' blindness." Omar bowed his head. The light reflected off his forehead, revealing fatigue and undisguised shame. He spoke slowly, almost pleadingly. "I know. But I need your help to reclaim justice. Only you understand the characters in the original text." Mira turned away, gently pulling the curtain. Outside, the night wind blew softly, carrying the scent of sand and distant salt air. She spoke, her voice softer, yet still firm. "You owe me nothing. But perhaps you owe yourself a chance to do the right thing. That sentence made Omar look up. In her eyes, he saw not hatred, but quiet tolerance. A tolerance that made one feel more ashamed than 100 words of blame. In that moment, the gentle tapping of a cane on the floor sounded. Mrs. Nadia walked out, her cloudy eyes directed toward the sound of the voices. She wore an old robe, holding a string of wooden prayer beads, counting them slowly, reverently. "Mira, you left the window open again. The night wind is cold, dear," she said, her voice gentle. Mira stepped forward to help her mother, but she gently waved her hand away, a faint smile still on her lips. She had not recognized that the man standing there was the Sheikh who had caused her daughter to lose her job. Omar watched silently. The blind mother, the calm daughter. The light from the hallway shone in, illuminating her face, making the eyes that saw no light seem to glow from within. Mrs. Nadia stopped, praying softly, her voice small but clear. "May God protect those who are lost, so they may find truth and kindness again." Omar froze. He couldn't take his eyes off the woman, who saw nothing, yet was praying for him. A lump formed in his throat. For the first time, he understood what it meant to be seen with the heart. He whispered, his voice hoarse, "Perhaps. I am the truly blind one." Mrs. Nadia gently tilted her head, seemingly having heard. She smiled kindly, reaching her hand out, seeking Omar's shoulder. Her finger gently touched his shirt, warm and trembling. "No one is blind if they still know how to repent, young man," she said slowly. "God sends someone not to ask for forgiveness, but to learn how to love again." Omar was speechless. His eyes moistened, but he did not turn away. He bowed his head, an action he had never performed for anyone in his life, and said softly, "Thank you, Mum. I am a man who has made mistakes." Mrs. Nadia nodded, her smile unchanged. "We all make mistakes, son. The important thing is whether we dare to look back." In that moment, Mira stood watching the two, one blind, but seeing the light, one powerful, but learning how to see. She said nothing, only felt her heart soften. Omar turned to her, his voice sincere. "I will leave. You two stay here. I need time to look at everything again." Mira gave a slight nod, her eyes no longer hard. "I wish you find your true light, Sheikh Al-Fahim." He smiled, bowed, and left the room. The sound of the door closing was soft, like a comma between two worlds. Mira stepped to the window, pulling back the curtain. Outside, the black SUV was still parked there. Omar did not drive away. He stood still, under the dull yellow street lamp, hands in his pockets, his eyes directed up to the room where the mother and daughter were staying. He watched for a long time, as if afraid that if he turned away, he would lose that fragile light forever. The night in Abu Dhabi was quiet. No more oud music, no lavish laughter of the powerful. Only the powerful man standing alone in the darkness, truly learning how to see for the first time. That night, Sheikh Omar Al-Fahim did not return to his villa. He stood under the yellow light, allowing the faint glow to illuminate his once blind eyes, and realized, true light does not come from a dazzling place, but from the courage to look into the darkness within oneself. The morning in Abu Dhabi was gentler than usual. The sunlight filtered through the thin curtains, falling on the white sheet in the small room where Mira and her mother were temporarily staying. Mrs. Nadia Haddad sat by the table, feeling for the hot teacup, her face as calm as if the previous night had been a long dream. Mira woke up, slowly tidied the blanket, and stepped into the hallway. The sky outside was pale, so quiet that she could clearly hear the sound of car wheels on a distant road. The black SUV was still parked at the corner, But the man from last night had left. On the wooden table, an envelope was neatly placed next to a small white jasmine flower, a delicate fragrance, just enough to make one pause. Mira opened the letter. Inside was not a check, nor an apology, only a job offer, printed on thick paper, faintly gold-edged. Falcon Holdings respectfully invites Ms. Mira Haddad to assume the position of Heritage Language Consultant, International Legal Department. Your role is especially vital in restoring and preserving the original value of ancient Persian texts in contracts and heritage documents. We believe that only you understand the language of truth. At the bottom of the letter was the signature of Omar Al-Fahim. No further explanation, no line saying, "I apologize." Just a few calm, simple words, the way a person seeks atonement through action rather than words. Mira placed the letter down, silent for a long time. From the corner of the table, the morning light shone on the paper, making the phrase, "language of truth," seem to glow. She took a deep breath. "Daughter, are they inviting you back?" Mrs. Nadia's voice came from behind, soft as mist. Mira turned back, smiling faintly. "Yes, Mother. But I will decline. I don't want anything to do with them anymore." Mrs. Nadia put her teacup down, running her hand across the table until she touched the paper. "The paper smells nice," she said softly, then paused, as if listening to her daughter's heartbeat. "Mira, I cannot see, but I feel the injustice that occurred. People can be wrong, but if they seek the truth, then you, who holds the light, should be the one to speak it." Mira was silent. Her voice continued, small, but enough to fill the room. "God does not send light to those who think they are right. He sends light to those who know they are lost." She walked to the window, looking down at the city. Dubai in the morning was dazzling, the sun reflecting off the glass buildings, brilliant and proud. But in that light, Mira suddenly felt empty. She wondered, if the light only comes from these buildings, then what darkness will illuminate those who are honest? The wind blew gently, rustling the curtain. That question echoed in her head, not to find an answer, but to regain faith. A belief that true light does not lie in power, but in daring to follow the truth, however lonely that path may be. She turned around, picking up the phone. Her voice was soft but clear. "Hello. I am Mira Haddad. I accept the job." A few hours later, top floor of the Emirates Towers. The Falcon Holdings office was bathed in a cold, white light. The glass walls reflected the shapes of people and the city, creating a feeling that everything was being scrutinized. Mira walked in, holding a stack of documents. Her hair was neatly tied, her eyes calm, neither resentful nor afraid. At the large meeting table, Omar Al-Fahim was waiting. He was no longer the arrogant sheikh of the party nights, but a man who had undergone an awakening. Still in a white shirt, but the collar button was open, the sleeves slightly rolled up. His face showed signs of fatigue, but his eyes were different, humble, quiet. He spoke, his voice calm. "Welcome." "Thank you for accepting the offer," Mira replied softly. "I am not doing this out of gratitude. I am doing it for justice." She paused, then added slowly, "And I will not accept the salary Falcon offered. I only need enough to care for my mother." Omar nodded. "Very well." His gaze softened, not the look of an employer, but of someone learning to respect. He did not look at her as a subordinate, but as the person illuminating the lost path. The first workday. Mira was given a small, simple, quiet office. On her desk were copies of ancient contracts, documents thick with Persian script, languages that had once been dismissed, now being restored by her, line by line. In front of the screen, She focused so intensely that she forgot the time. In the adjacent room, through the frosted glass, Omar stood watching silently. No more judgmental looks, only the observation of someone witnessing intelligence at work. He listened to her explain during the first meeting, her voice even and sure. They used a clause-shifting structure, seemingly harmless, but it was a way to legitimize the seizure. Julien knew you couldn't read ancient Persian, so he hid the crime within the words. Omar nodded slightly. He did not interrupt. For the first time, he saw the beauty of knowledge, a beauty that needed no adornment, only the light of intellect. And in that moment, he realized, she is not just translating the language, she is translating the part of the soul that I lost. In the following days, Mira discovered more irregularities in Julien Marchand's files. Foreign transactions, fake green conservation companies, all were essentially a sophisticated money laundering network hidden behind the guise of charity. She sent Omar an internal note. He doesn't just want the Sharif land. His goal is much bigger, and someone is still watching us. Just minutes later, Omar replied briefly, I know. And I am no longer afraid. His voice was no longer sharp. It was deep, profound, and sincere, like a person learning to trust in goodness. That afternoon, Mira left the building. The wind blew softly, the sun shone through the glass, reflecting her long shadow on the stone floor. From the opposite side, a grey car softly started its engine. The person inside did not show their face, only watched. But Mira felt it. Danger was still close by. She gripped the document bag in her hand, not looking back, because for the first time, she knew she was no longer alone. On the other side of the glass, a man had chosen the light, and this time he would not close his eyes again. The secretary's warning about the grey car prompted Omar to act. He invited Mira into a private conference room where no listening devices were insured. Mira spread Julian's document schematics on the table. She had found his tracks. Julien was not limited to scamming Omar out of the Sharif land, but was using Falcon Holdings as a front to conceal a network of green contract companies for laundering money from seized assets in Europe. He is using your reputation to launder money, Mira explained, pointing to a suspicious transaction line. If we don't act, Falcon will be accused of complicity. Omar listened. His face was tense, but instead of pounding the table, he stood up and walked toward the coffee machine in the corner. Black coffee or herbal tea? He asked, his voice calmer. Herbal tea, if possible, sir. Coffee makes it hard for me to focus on ancient languages. Omar brewed her a hot cup of tea. He placed the tea in front of Mira, then sat down. The anger of a sheikh had been replaced by the focus of a partner. I will use every asset of Falcon, every political connection, to bring Julien down immediately, Omar said. This is the only way to restore honor. Mira took a sip of tea, the warmth spreading through her palms. She looked straight at him. If we use dirty tricks, we are no different from him. Your honor lies in how you fight, not in speed. I am used to solving everything quickly, Omar confessed, rubbing his forehead. My father taught me that weakness is the most expensive price to pay. And my mother taught me that honesty is the only light, Mira gently countered. My mother is blind, but she sees the truth more clearly than anyone. Do you want the Sharif land restored with truth, or with another dirty fight? Omar looked at her, accepting the painful truth. So what do you want? We need to find the legal loophole in his language to announce the truth according to the correct procedures, Mira said. He is watching us. He will think we will use money. We must use intellect. During a brief break, Omar asked, Your mother, how is she doing? She is peaceful. She thinks I am doing good work, and that is enough. Mira replied. My mother always said, knowledge of language is the most precious heritage you carry. It cannot be stolen. Omar nodded, understanding. Mira's words were not just professional advice, but a lesson on legacy. That night, they worked late. The soft yellow light from the desk lamp illuminated the documents. As Mira explained a complex term, she saw Omar listening intently. She smiled slightly. You see, language also has emotion. It's not just words, but intention. I am used to numbers that have no emotion. Your language is much more interesting, Omar laughed, a rare and genuine smile. Mira discovered a small detail. Julian had sent the original, falsified, documents to the address of a construction contractor right there in the local area. He is about to sell off the land quickly, she concluded. She noted the information, sending Omar a summary. I am not lying. Someone is still watching us. He immediately replied, I know, and I am no longer afraid. When Mira stood up to leave, Omar remained seated. The office light shone out, enveloping both figures. Mira fleetingly sensed someone observing them from across the street. She placed her hand lightly on Omar's shoulder. It was a gesture of confirmation. We are in this together. In the reflected light, both understood. Danger was close, but they now shared a common language for the fight. Night descended upon Dubai like a dark silk cloth draped over the brightly lit buildings. The 47th floor of Falcon still had lights on, where Mira had just completed the final translation. Every word she typed today carried the weight of truth, and in every breath she clearly felt. The darkness was beginning to stir. She gathered her papers, her eyes sweeping over the corner of the meeting table. There, a small object glinted, a silver lighter engraved with Julian Marchand's name. Perhaps he had left it during his visit to the office a few days ago. Mira gently touched it, a shiver running through her. The cold metal seemed to hold a premonition of what was about to happen. When Mira left the building, it was nearly midnight. The desert wind blew softly, carrying the scent of sand and the distant sea. She was driven back to the safe house in the familiar black SUV. In her pocket, her phone vibrated. A message from Omar. Get some rest. Tomorrow morning, we will present the file to the board. I am ready. Mira smiled faintly. For the first time, his voice did not make her feel pressured. She looked up at the star-filled sky, a sky that people like Omar rarely looked up to because they were too busy looking down at the world. She opened the door to her room. Everything was quiet. Mrs. Nadia was asleep, her face peaceful in the small lamplight from the corner table. Mira changed her jacket, setting down her document bag. But then, her phone rang. On the other end was the voice of an old acquaintance, a neighbor from the old rented room. The voice trembled. Mira! Your old building is on fire. Luckily, you and your mother moved out early. She stood frozen, gripping the phone tightly. Her heart pounded wildly. She didn't need to ask why. Her intuition told her, Julian Marchand. He was sending a warning, not to harm, but to silence her forever. Mira immediately called Omar. Julian has done something. My old place is on fire. He wants me to be afraid. Her voice trembled, but was not weak. On the other end, Omar replied slowly, every word clear. Stay where you are. I'm coming right now. Half an hour later, Dubai was steeped in silence. The black SUV turned into the safe house compound. Before the car fully stopped, Omar could smell smoke lingering in the air. Not thick smoke, but the smell of burnt plastic, small, fragmented, signaling a disaster that had just reached the threshold. He rushed into the hallway, where the lights flickered erratically. Mira's shadow appeared at the end of the corridor, her hand struggling to cut the power from a sparking electrical socket. Be careful! Omar called out. Mira turned around. Her face was pale in the dim light. Behind her, Mrs. Nadia was still sleeping, but thin smoke had begun to creep around the ceiling. Just seconds later, Julian appeared in the open doorway. No words were needed, no expression, just a faint smile and a gaze as cold as metal. He walked slowly, his voice booming like wind through a crack. "I told you, you don't understand the language of power, Mira." He stepped toward the socket, pulling hard on the cord, sparks flying out. The lights in the room went out, leaving only the flickering light from the exposed bulb. "Just a tiny bit of light is enough to burn everything you believe in," he said, then stepped back, disappearing into the hallway. In that moment, Mira knew the room was about to catch fire for real. The curtain near the socket began to scorch, the acrid smell of smoke entering her throat. She coughed violently, turning to her mother. "Mother, wake up! Hurry, Mother!" Mrs. Nadia started awake, still not understanding what was happening. Omar rushed over, covering the fire with his jacket, but the sparks spread faster than expected. He looked around. No emergency exit was close enough. He bent down, speaking quickly. "I'll carry her out." "Mira, stay close to me. Don't leave." He lifted Mrs. Nadia, his strong hands gentle, as if afraid of hurting her. She trembled, her hand still clutching her prayer beads. As Omar carried her out of the room, Mira stayed close behind, trying to hold her breath amidst the thick smoke. Every step was a challenge. Every breath was a plea. No more shouting, only the sound of heartbeats mixed with the faint prayer of the blind mother. "May God preserve this light. Don't let it extinguish." They reached the hallway. The air was cooler, the wind from the emergency exit rushing in. Omar gently placed Mrs. Nadia down on a stone bench outside. He breathed heavily, his shirt stained with smoke, but his eyes were brighter than ever. Police and fire trucks arrived minutes later. The fire in the room was extinguished in time. No one was harmed. Julian vanished into the darkness, like a spirit of deceit, leaving behind only the smell of scorching and the silver lighter rolling on the cement floor. Mira stood silently watching the last glow fade, her eyes teary. Omar approached, his voice hoarse. "Are you all right?" Mira shook her head. Tears rolled down, but she was no longer trembling. She turned to look at him. The man who had once dismissed her, once despised her, now bending over, his hands still shaking from carrying her mother out of the fire. She spoke slowly, her voice choked but warm. "You once said, the Sheikh would belong to the one who understood the light. Now I understand that light lies not in intellect or money, but in kindness." Omar did not reply. He just bowed his head slightly, his eyes moist, as if something had been cleansed. He placed his hand on her shoulder, gently but firmly. "Thank you for not letting me get lost in the darkness." They stood still for a long time. The Dubai night wind swept through, carrying the scent of the recently extinguished smoke, acrid, warm, and strangely peaceful. Above, the sky opened up, the stars twinkling as witnesses to an act of redemption. That night, no one said anything further. Mira sat beside her mother. Omar stood quietly behind them. The faint yellow street light illuminated them. 3 different people, now all illuminated by a single light. The light of kindness and truth, a light no one could put out. After the fire, Omar knew time was running out. Julian's violent attack proved that he was preparing to announce his final plan. Omar moved Mira and her mother to a secure family villa, where no one could reach them. The next morning, the grand ballroom of Dubai's most luxurious hotel was chosen as the venue for a critical press conference on the future of regional investment. This was the stage of honor Julian had chosen to officially announce the transfer of the Sharif land to the construction contractor, simultaneously destroying Falcon Holdings' reputation. Julian appeared, confident and radiant. He began his speech with a smooth tone, praising the transparency of the new agreement. Omar and Mira sat in the front row. Mira's presence, the girl who had been fired, drew attention. Julian began his attack. He displayed the contract bearing Omar's signature. "Regrettably," Julian said, his voice dramatic, "I discovered that Falcon Holdings deliberately replaced senior staff with unqualified individuals. They even hired a waitress to forge documents to obstruct this agreement." Julian pointed directly at Mira. This girl, Mira Haddad, deliberately misrepresented the legal text. She lacks the qualifications to understand international law. She is merely a dirty tool. The hall buzzed. Investors and reporters turned their cameras toward Mira. Omar immediately stood up. He did not refute with words, but with action. "Before Mr. Marchand continues his slander," Omar said, his voice deep and powerful, "I think we should all listen to this recording." Omar's secretary played the recording over the hall speakers. It was the clip of Julian trying to entice Mira to amend the translation error in the office, and his voice talking about exploiting Omar's blindness to the ancient Persian language to get rich quick. Julian's voice echoed clearly. "As long as he doesn't understand that word, amanat. He's too arrogant to listen to a waitress." The hall fell silent. All attention focused on Julian. His face turned from confidence to stark white. Omar turned to Mira. "I want the person who saw the light to speak the truth." Mira stepped onto the stage, taking the microphone without a hint of fear. She was no longer the timid waitress. She was the custodian of the language of truth. She didn't need complex translation. She projected the original ancient Persian text onto the large screen. This contract is fake. It is not just fraud concerning words, but a betrayal of context and ethics. Mira explained how Julian had interwoven the ancient proverb about permanent severance among the standard clauses. She pointed out the deviation in cultural meaning and heritage context, proving Julian deliberately exploited Omar's lack of knowledge to seize the asset. She concluded, looking straight at Julian, "Sheikh Al-Fahim's language is built on honor. Mr. Marchand's language is built on lies. Once you understand the language of truth, all lies vanish." Julian knew he had lost. He tried to run, but was stopped by economic police, who appeared and blocked his path. Julian was escorted out of the hall amidst the chaos of camera flashes. As he passed Mira, he threw one last sentence. "You think you won, waitress? Truth always has a price." The hall erupted in applause and murmurs. Omar stepped forward to stand beside Mira. He had regained his honor, not through money, but through truth and humility. They stood together on the stage. Their victory was a victory of ethics and justice. As the police escorted Julian away, Mira and Omar remained on the stage. They were in no hurry to leave, even though hundreds of cameras were pointed at them. Mira felt the light from the camera flashes was dazzling, but this time, she was not blinded. Omar turned to her. He didn't need to apologize. His action of saving her mother and his public respect had said it all. "Thank you, Mira," he said softly, only loud enough for the two of them to hear. "You saved Falcon's honor, and more importantly, you taught me how to see." A few weeks later, everything settled down. Julian's scandal was resolved, and the Sharif land was restored to the community. Mira was invited to Omar's office. He had changed greatly. No longer the cold distance, but a new tranquility. Omar handed her a file. It was the official appointment decision. Chief Consultant for Heritage Language and Education Development at Falcon Holdings. "This is the position you deserve, Mira," Omar said. "You are the one who best understands the true value of language and heritage." Mira accepted the document. She did not refuse the position, knowing she needed it to continue fighting for the truth. "I will accept the job, sir," Mira said, her eyes resolute. "But I have one condition. I will not accept the salary Falcon is offering." Omar raised an eyebrow. "Then what do you want?" Mira smiled gently. "I want you to use the difference from that salary and the recovered project funds to build a library, a special library for the blind, where they can learn Braille and access ancient cultural and linguistic texts. I want it named after my mother, Nadia Haddad." This request went far beyond any expectation of material compensation. It was a symbolic act of her belief. Omar looked at her. He understood that his redemption had to be in action, not words. "I agree," he replied decisively. "We will build it. It will be the true light." 6 months later, the construction was complete. Nadia Haddad's House of Light was a modern yet warm structure located in the restored area of Sharif. At the opening ceremony, in front of community representatives, Mrs. Nadia sat in the front row, her hands feeling the embossed books. Omar stepped onto the podium. He didn't talk about profit or contracts. He talked about humility. He looked at Mira standing next to her mother, then looked at everyone. He recited the ancient Persian verse that he had once used to mock her, but now he read it with complete understanding. "One sees with the eyes, but is blind in the light." He paused, looking directly at Mira, his eyes filled with deep respect and affection. "The one who sees with the eyes, but is blind in the light. That was me, before I met you," Omar whispered, acknowledging his transformation. Mira smiled. She stepped onto the podium, taking his hand. Her voice resonated. "But there is one who, though once blind in the light, now knows how to see with the heart." The morning sun reflected through the library's windows, the light bathing Mira and Omar's faces. The scene closed with an image of older women tracing Braille letters in a room filled with light. The light had merged. There was no longer any distinction of class or blindness due to power. The large room was flooded with the morning sunlight. Inside, dozens of women, mostly elderly, sat around warm wooden tables. They were tracing the embossed pages of Braille books. They could not see the light shining through the windows, but they were learning to read it. Mira stood beside Omar, watching the scene. This library, Nadia Haddad's House of Light, was the embodiment of redemption. Omar turned slightly to Mira, his eyes holding deep respect and an affection that had surpassed the boundaries of business. "The one who sees with the eyes, but is blind in the light. That was me, before I met you," he said softly, repeating the verse he now fully understood. Mira did not respond with complex poetry. She simply took his hand. The hand that once trembled while pouring wine now rested confidently in the hand of the powerful Sheikh. "But there is one who, though once blind in the light, now knows how to see with the heart," she replied, confirming the transformation not just in him, but in her own belief in human kindness. The sunlight continued to stream through the glass, creating a brilliant golden streak on the floor. Mira and Omar stood side by side, no longer the Sheikh and the waitress, but two people viewing the world with a common language. In that room, among the women patiently seeking knowledge, light was no longer a symbol of wealth or power. It was a symbol of truth, and it had erased all blindness. Perhaps what moves us most is not how Mira saved Sheikh Omar's honor, but how she chose to forgive through action, not words. In a world where people are easily blinded by power and pride, she proved that true light is not in the eyes, but in the heart that knows how to see what is right. Omar once thought he understood everything: language, money, power. But it turned out that what he needed to relearn was the language of humility. When he knelt to apologize, when he carried the blind mother through the fire, when he built the library named after her, each small act was how he translated his life, from arrogance to benevolence. As for Mira, she did not seek victory. She only wanted to preserve a small space of conscience in the world. Small, but enough to illuminate the way back for those who were once blind, like Omar. Sometimes the light is not found in dazzling places, but in the moment we stop, know how to bow our heads, and know how to listen to a sincere heart. And perhaps today's story leaves us with a small question. When facing what is right and what is easy, will you choose the light or close your eyes and pass it by? If this story touched you, please let me know. Have you ever encountered the light in your life? I truly want to hear your answer.